The wind that swept down through the crimson canyons of the territory carried the scent of sagebrush, dry earth, and the distant, acrid tang of coal smoke. It was the smell of a changing world, a collision between the ancient silence of the high desert and the iron roar of progress. In the year 1880, the sun did not merely shine upon the town of Redstone. It hammered against it, bleaching the rough-hewn timber of the storefronts and turning the dust in the streets into a choking, copper-colored fog. Redstone was a scar on the valley floor, a cluster of ambition and desperation that had sprung up where the water ran deep. It consisted of two main streets that formed a muddy cross, lined with a saloon that never closed, a general store with exorbitant prices, a modest wooden church with a leaning steeple, and the skeletal frame of a railway station that was currently half built. The hammering from the rail crews echoed off the canyon walls like the steady beat of a war drum, signaling the relentless approach of the Western Iron Line. Sheriff Ethan Cole stood on the porch of his office, his thumbs hooked into his gun belt, watching the heat waves shimmy off the hard-packed dirt. He was a man carved from the same rugged landscape that surrounded him, standing well over 6 feet, with shoulders broadened by years of hard labor and military service. Ethan possessed a stillness that unsettled the more boisterous residents of the town. His hair was the color of dark walnut, dusted with the gray of the road, and his eyes were the shade of worn steel eyes that had seen too much and now sought only quiet. He was 34 years old, though the lines etched around his eyes suggested a man a decade older. He wore the tin star on his vest not out of a desire for power, but out of a penitent need for order. As a former cavalryman in the Union Army, Ethan had ridden through the smoke of burning villages and heard the screams that no amount of whiskey could drown out. He had traded his blue coat for a sheriff's badge, hoping that by keeping the peace in this forgotten corner of the territory, he might eventually find some for himself, beyond the town. Past the ridge where the red rock jutted into the sky like broken teeth, lay the only thing that truly mattered to Ethan. The locals called it Cole's Lake, simply because it sat on the parcel of land the government had granted him after the war. But to the indigenous people who had roamed these lands long before the first surveyor drove a stake into the ground, it was the Lake of Souls' sacred water. It was a miracle in the desert, a deep, spring-fed pool of impossible blue that reflected the sky so perfectly, it felt like looking into another world. "Hot enough to melt the devil's horns today, Sheriff?" a voice grated from the shadows. Ethan did not flinch. He turned his head slowly to see his deputy, Hank Mercer, leaning against the doorframe. Mercer was a man of wiry build and shifting eyes, a local who had grown up poor and mean, now wearing a badge that gave his cruelty a legal outlet. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, narrowly missing a passing beetle. "It is summer, Hank," Ethan said, his voice a low rumble. "It is supposed to be hot." "Heard rumors the rail crew had trouble again last night," Mercer said, wiping his mouth with the back of a dirty sleeve. "Someone cut the perimeter wire, let the horses loose. Foreman says it was that ghost warrior again." Ethan looked back toward the distant red cliffs. "Did anyone see him?" "No, never do. Just footprints that vanish into the rock. I tell you, Ethan, it is just a matter of time before I put a bullet in one of those redskins. They are pests, plain and simple. We do not shoot without cause, Hank," Ethan said sharply. "And we do not shoot at ghosts," Mercer sneered, adjusting his gun belt. "You are too soft on them. Just because you have that treaty with old Chief Black Cloud doesn't mean his strays respect the law." "The treaty keeps the peace," Ethan replied. "The railway is the intruder here, not them." Before Mercer could retort, the sound of hoofbeats and the rattle of a carriage approached, a sleek black buggy, far too polished for the rugged terrain of Redstone, pulled up in front of the sheriff's office. The man who stepped down brushed imaginary dust from his immaculate black frock coat. Silas Harlow was the face of the Western Iron Line in this sector. He was a handsome man in a predatory way, with a smile that showed too many teeth and eyes that held the cold calculation of a reptile. He tipped his hat to Ethan, though the gesture held no respect. "Sheriff Cole," Silas said, his voice smooth as oil. "And Deputy Mercer, a pleasure, as always. Mr. Harlow," Ethan acknowledged with a nod. "To what do I owe the visit?" Silas stepped onto the porch, invading Ethan's personal space with the scent of expensive cologne and stale cigar smoke. "I wish to discuss a business proposition, one that could make a man of your stature very comfortable. I understand you have refused my previous offers regarding the water rights to your property." "I told you, Silas," Ethan said, crossing his arms. "The lake is not for sale. Everything is for sale. Sheriff, it is merely a question of price. The company needs a reliable water station for the locomotives. Your lake is the only viable source for 50 miles. Plus, our geologists believe the rock formations beneath that water are rich in copper." Silas leaned in closer. "Imagine it. Coal, $5,000. You could leave this dust bowl, go to San Francisco, live like a king." "And what happens to Redstone?" Ethan asked, his gaze hardening. "That lake feeds the creek that waters the livestock in this valley. You drain it for your trains and your mines. And this town dies. And the tribe up in the hills, they rely on that water too." Silas chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "Progress requires sacrifice. As for the savages, their time has passed. The era of the chaotic frontier is ending. Sheriff, the Iron Road brings order. You are a man of the law. Surely you understand the necessity of order." "There is a difference between order and greed," Ethan said. "As long as I wear this badge and hold the deed to that land, no pipes touch that water, and no dynamite touches those rocks." Silas's smile did not waver, but his eyes turned icy. He glanced at Mercer, who was watching the exchange with hungry interest. "A man who stands in the way of a locomotive usually gets crushed. Sheriff, I would hate to see a war hero come to such an undignified end. Is that a threat, Mr. Harlow?" "Merely an observation of physics," Silas said, placing his hat back on his head. "Good day, gentlemen." Ethan watched the carriage roll away. He felt the tension coiling in his gut, a familiar sensation that usually preceded violence. "You are a fool," Mercer muttered, spitting again. $5,000. I would sell my own mother for half that." "I know you would." "Hank," Ethan said quietly, "that is why I'm the sheriff. And you are not." High above the valley, perched on a limestone outcropping that offered a view of the entire basin, the one they called the Ghost Warrior watched the interaction through a stolen brass spyglass. Naya Red Elk lowered the glass, her dark eyes narrowing against the glare. She was not a ghost, though she moved like one. She was a woman of 24 years, her body honed by a life of survival in the high desert. She wore buckskin leggings and a tunic that allowed for silent movement, and around her neck hung a necklace of silver and turquoise, a gift from her mother, the daughter of the clan chief. Her heritage was written on her face, the high cheekbones and bronze skin of her mother's people, but with a certain sharpness to her nose and a depth to her eyes that came from her father, a white trapper who had died before she could remember him. She belonged to two worlds, yet was fully accepted by neither. To the whites, she was a savage. To some of the traditional elders in her tribe, her mixed blood made her unpredictable. But out here, in the wind and the rock, she was simply Naya, free. She ran a hand over the smooth wood of her bow, though at her hip rested a heavy Colt revolver she had taken from a drunken soldier 2 winters ago. She hated the iron snake that the white men were building. It ate the land, frightened the game, and brought more and more settlers who fenced off the open range. She looked back toward the sheriff's office. The tall man, the one called Cole, puzzled her. He was a bluecoat, a soldier of the government that had pushed her people to the brink. Yet, he was different. She had watched him from the shadows many times. She had seen him stop a group of cowboys from harassing an old Navajo woman selling baskets in town. She had seen him ride to the sacred lake, not to hunt or to claim, but simply to sit in silence. He refused the man in black again, she whispered to the wind, her English accented but clear. She knew the man in black Harlow was dangerous. He smelled of snake oil and lies. He wanted the sacred lake. The thought made Naya's grip tighten on her bow. The lake was the dwelling place of the spirits, It was where the water washed away the dust of the mortal world. If the iron snake drank from it, the spirits would leave, and the land would die. "I will not let them take it," she vowed. She moved back from the edge, her moccasins making no sound on the stone. She vanished into the labyrinth of the canyons, a shadow slipping between the cracks of the earth. Night fell over Redstone like a heavy blanket. The heat of the day lingered in the wooden floorboards of the buildings, radiating upward. The saloon was roaring with the noise of piano music, clinking glasses, and the loud, boastful laughter of men who worked too hard and drank too much. Ethan walked his rounds, the rhythmic thud of his boots on the boardwalk a steady counterpoint to the chaos. He broke up a fist fight between two rail workers over a card game, dragged a drunk to the jail cell to sleep it off, and ensured the girls working the balcony were not being mistreated. It was the mundane maintenance of civilization, a job that felt increasingly futile. When the town finally quieted, sinking into a drunken slumber around 2 o'clock in the morning, Ethan returned to his small room behind the office. He sat on the edge of his cot, unbuckling his gun belt and hanging it on the bedpost. He washed his face in the basin, the water tepid and smelling of iron. He dreaded sleep. Sleep was where the memories waited. He lay back, closing his eyes, and exhaustion pulled him under. Immediately. He was back in the Dakotas. The year was 1874. The snow was stained with red. The air was filled with the smoke of burning lodges. He was on his horse, saber drawn, surrounded by the chaos of a raid gone wrong. He saw a woman running, clutching a bundle to her chest. He shouted for his men to hold fire, but the roar of the carbines drowned him out. He saw the woman fall. He saw the bundle roll away a child, crying. Ethan spurred his horse forward, trying to reach the child, trying to shield it. But the fire rose up, a wall of heat and screaming timber. The flames morphed into the face of his commanding officer, laughing, telling him it was necessary. Ethan woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright in the dark. His chest heaved, his skin slick with cold sweat. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The silence of the room was deafening. The shadows in the corner seemed to twist into the shapes of the dead. "God," he whispered, running a shaking hand through his hair. He could not stay here. The walls were too close. The air was too still. He needed the water. He dressed quickly, his hands moving with the muscle memory of a soldier. He strapped his gun belt back on, not because he expected trouble, but because a man did not go unarmed in this territory. He grabbed his hat and walked out to the stables. His horse, a massive roan gelding named Buster, nickered softly as Ethan approached. "Easy, boy," Ethan murmured, stroking the velvet nose. "Just us ghosts awake tonight." He saddled the horse in the moonlight, the leather creaking softly. Within 10 minutes, he was riding out of Redstone, leaving the sleeping town and its small, petty sins behind. The desert at night was a different world. The heat had vanished, replaced by a sharp, crisp chill. The moonlight turned the cactus and mesquite into silver sculptures. The vastness of the sky, cluttered with more stars than a man could count in a dozen lifetimes, made Ethan feel small. He liked feeling small. It made his guilt feel smaller too, if only for a moment. He rode toward the depression in the hills where the land dipped down into the secret valley holding the lake. It was a 5-mile ride, a journey he made almost every night when the demons would not let him rest. The lake was his sanctuary. It was the one place where the blood of the past seemed to wash away. The water there was cool and deep, fed by underground aquifers that had never seen the sun until they bubbled up into the basin. As he crested the final ridge, the lake spread out before him, a sheet of obsidian mirroring the Milky Way. It was silent, save for the whisper of the wind through the cottonwood trees that lined the far bank. Ethan felt his shoulders drop. The tension that held his spine rigid all day finally loosened. He was alone. Here. He did not have to be the sheriff. He did not have to be a veteran. He could just be a man breathing the night air. He guided Buster down the narrow trail toward the water's edge. He planned to sit on the flat rock near the pier he had half built, smoke a cigarette, and maybe cast a line if he felt like it. Mostly, he just wanted to listen to the water lap against the shore. He did not know that the peace he sought was about to be shattered. He did not know that the lake was not empty tonight. He did not know that the intersection of his world and the ancient world of the ghost warrior was waiting for him in the water. Ethan Cole took a deep breath of the cool air, believing he was alone in his sanctuary, and urged his horse forward into the shadows of the cottonwoods. The water beckoned, promising silence, but fate had prepared a different kind of quiet, the breathless hush before a storm. The morning sun rose over the eastern ridges like a blacksmith's hammer striking an anvil, instantly heating the air and turning the dust of the valley into a shimmering mist. It was a few days after Silas Harlow's visit, and the tension in Redstone had tightened like a bowstring. For Sheriff Ethan Cole, the nights had offered no relief. The nightmares of the war had returned with renewed ferocity, filled with the screams of the dying and the smell of charred timber. To escape the lingering ghosts of his sleep, Ethan had saddled his horse, Buster, long before the town began to stir. He rode out toward the lake, seeking the only thing that could settle the tremors in his hands, the silence of the water. The ride took him through the scrub brush and the twisting paths of the canyon. By the time he reached the crest of the hill overlooking the basin, the sun was already high enough to burn the back of his neck. He scanned the area with the practiced eye of a scout. There were no fresh tracks on the trail, no sign of the wild mustangs that sometimes came down to drink, and certainly no sign of the railway surveyors who had been prowling the edges of his property. It was empty, just the way he needed it to be. Ethan guided Buster down the slope and tied him to a mesquite tree 100 yards back from the water's edge. He wanted to walk the rest of the way. He wanted to feel the ground under his boots and hear the wind moving through the cottonwoods without the creak of saddle leather interfering. He walked quietly, a habit he had never been able to shake since his days in the cavalry. As he neared the dense thicket of willows that screened the shoreline, he heard a sound. It was not the wind, nor was it the cry of a hawk. It was the rhythmic, gentle splash of water being disturbed. Ethan froze, his hand instinctively drifting to the Colt on his hip. His first thought was of a deer, or perhaps a mountain lion cooling itself in the heat. He moved forward, stepping with infinite care, parting the willow branches just enough to see through. The air left his lungs in a sharp, silent rush. It was not a deer. In the center of the lake, where the water was deepest and the blue was most intense, a woman was bathing. She was facing away from him, unaware of his presence. She was completely naked, her body a stark, beautiful contrast against the dark stillness of the water. Ethan felt a jolt go through him, a mixture of shock and an immediate, undeniable pull that had nothing to do with duty. He stood paralyzed, unable to look away. The sunlight caught the droplets of water sliding down the curve of her spine, illuminating skin the color of burnished copper. Her hair, black as a raven's wing and heavy with water, floated around her shoulders like a dark halo. She was not soft in the way the women in the city were soft. Even from this distance, Ethan could see the definition of muscle in her back and arms. She moved with a powerful, fluid grace, dipping her head back to let the water cascade over her face. There was a raw, unashamed freedom in her movements that Ethan had not seen in years, perhaps never. She looked like a part of the landscape itself, as natural and wild as the red rocks towering above them. He knew he should turn. He knew he should back away quietly and ride back to town, leaving her dignity intact. But for a heartbeat that stretched into an eternity, he was simply a man, captivated by a vision of beauty in a world that had shown him mostly ugliness. Then he shifted his weight. The dry branch of a dead sagebrush snapped under his boot. In the silence of the basin, the sound cracked like a pistol shot. The reaction in the water was instantaneous. The woman spun around, not with a scream, but with the silent, deadly speed of a predator. She submerged herself until the water lapped at her collarbone, her eyes locking onto the spot where Ethan stood concealed. "Show yourself," she commanded. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a steel edge that cut through the heat. She spoke English, but the cadence was of the earth, rhythmic and sharp. Ethan stepped out from the willows, raising his hands slowly to show he was not drawing a weapon. He felt the heat rising in his face, a flush of shame that burned hotter than the sun. "I apologize, Miss," Ethan called out, his voice rough. "I did not know anyone was here. I own this land. I thought I was alone." The woman did not retreat. She stared at him, her eyes dark and fierce, narrowing as she assessed him. She did not look frightened. She looked lethal. With a swift movement of her hand beneath the water, she grabbed something from a flat rock that protruded from the surface near her. It was a knife, a long, bone-handled blade that glinted in the sun. "Turn around," she hissed. "Turn around or bleed. White man." Ethan blinked, taken aback by the ferocity of the threat. She was neck-deep in water, naked, and outnumbered by a man with a gun on his hip. Yet she held the knife as if she were the one in control. "I am turning," Ethan said quickly, spinning on his heel to face the trees. "I am turning. You have my word." He stood with his back to the lake, his heart hammering against his ribs. He heard the sound of her moving through the water, the splash of steps approaching the shore. Every instinct in his body screamed at him that he was vulnerable, exposing his back to an armed opponent, but he forced himself to stand still. "I did not mean to intrude," Ethan said, addressing the trees. "I ride out here most mornings. I have never seen anyone else at the lake." "You look, but you do not see." Her voice came from behind him, closer now. He could hear the rustle of buckskin and fabric. "This water belongs to the earth. It does not belong to a paper in your pocket. According to the territory law, it does," Ethan corrected gently, though he kept his back turned. "But I am not here to argue the law. I am just—" He trailed off. "Just what just a lonely man looking for peace." "You are the sheriff," she said. It was a statement, not a question. Ethan stiffened. "I am—" "Turn—" Ethan hesitated. "Are you decent?" "I am armed," she replied. "That is decent enough." Ethan turned slowly. She was standing 10 feet away from him, dressed now in a tunic of soft leather and leggings, though her feet were bare and her hair still dripped water onto her shoulders. The knife was sheathed at her belt, but her hand rested near it. Up close, she was striking. Her face was angular and strong, with high cheekbones and a mouth set in a firm line, but it was her eyes that held him. They were intelligent, probing, and filled with a deep, ancient rage. He recognized the necklace she wore, silver and turquoise, crafted in the style of the Navajo. "You are of the Red Elk clan," Ethan said, his eyes dropping to the necklace and then returning to her face. "They talk about you in town. They call you the Ghost Warrior." She lifted her chin defiantly. "My name is Naya, and I do not care what the town calls me." "Ethan Cole," he offered. "I know who you are," Naya said coldly. "You are the one who wears the metal star, the one who thinks he keeps the peace." "I try," Ethan said. "I saw the tracks near the cut railway fences last week. They were small. Like yours." Naya stepped closer, invading his space. She smelled of lake water, sage, and wood smoke. "The iron snake eats the land. It scares the game. It poisons the silence. I cut its skin because it does not belong here. Cutting fences will not stop the train." "Naya," Ethan said, finding himself strangely compelled by her intensity. "It will only bring soldiers, and soldiers bring blood. I do not want to see your people hurt." "You speak of mercy," Naya scoffed, looking at the scar on his chin, a souvenir from the war. "But you serve the men who bring the iron. Why did you not shoot me when I was in the water? You had the advantage." Ethan looked at her, really looked at her. He remembered the image of her in the water, the raw beauty of it, and the strange ache it had awakened in him. "Because being a sheriff does not mean I stopped being a man, and a man does not shoot a woman who is bathing, no matter whose fences she cuts." Naya studied him, her grip on her knife loosening slightly. She had expected insults. She had expected him to leer or to threaten her with arrest. Instead, he looked tired and sad. There was a heaviness in him that she recognized, a weight similar to the one her people carried. "This lake," Naya said, her voice dropping an octave, losing some of its sharp edge. "We call it the Lake of Spirits. It is where my ancestors came to speak to the sky, long before your government drew lines on a map." "I know," Ethan said softly. "That is why I have not sold it to the railroad. They want it. Silas Harlow wants to drain it for his steam engines." Surprise flickered in Naya's eyes. "You refused him." "I did." "Why?" "Because—" Ethan looked past her at the shimmering blue water. "Some things are worth more than $5,000. And I suspect if this water goes, the last bit of soul left in this valley goes with it." For a moment, the silence between them was not hostile. It was charged, heavy with the unspoken recognition of two solitary creatures meeting in the wild. Ethan felt a pull toward her that frightened him. It was dangerous. She was everything the town hated, everything his badge was supposed to control. Yet, standing there with her wet hair clinging to her neck and fire in her eyes, she was the most vibrant living thing he had seen in a decade. Naya felt it too. The heat radiating from him was not just the sun. He was a white man, an enemy, but he protected the water. He had seen her naked, vulnerable, yet he spoke to her with respect. It confused her, and confusion was dangerous for a warrior. "Do not think we are friends, Sheriff," Naya said, stepping back, putting distance between them. "If you let the Iron Snake drink from this lake, I will treat you like any other intruder." "I intend to keep the lake as it is," Ethan said. "But you need to be careful. Naya, Deputy Mercer is looking for a reason to start a war. Do not give him one." "The war started long ago," Naya said. She turned and began to walk away, melting into the brush as silently as smoke. "Watch your back. Ethan Cole, the desert has eyes." Ethan watched her go until she was nothing more than a shadow among the rocks. He let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. His hands were trembling slightly. He told himself it was the adrenaline of the confrontation, but deep down, he knew it was something else. He had seen the spirit of the land made flesh, and he knew he would never look at this lake, or his life, in the same way again. A mile away, atop a ridge of red sandstone, a man sat on his horse, chewing on a piece of dried beef. His name was Jeb Miller, a drifter who worked odd jobs for the cattle ranchers and occasionally ran messages for the railway. He lowered his binoculars, a slow, ugly grin spreading across his dusty face. He had seen it all. The sheriff's horse tied up, the Indian woman coming out of the water, the two of them standing close, talking like lovers. "Well, I will be damned," Jeb chuckled to himself. "The high and mighty Sheriff Cole, preaching law and order while he is out here dipping his wick with a savage." He turned his horse toward town. This was information that was worth money, and he knew exactly who would pay for it. By noon, the heat in the Redstone Saloon was thick enough to choke a mule. Deputy Hank Mercer sat at a corner table, nursing a warm beer. Opposite him sat Silas Harlow, who was meticulously cutting a steak into precise, bite-sized squares. Jeb Miller stood by the table, his hat in his hand, looking eager. "Are you sure of what you saw?" Silas asked, not looking up from his plate. "Sure as I am standing here, Mr. Harlow," Jeb said. "It was the Red Elk woman. The one they call the Ghost Warrior, naked as the day she was born. And the sheriff, well, he was right there with her. They were close, real close. Didn't look like he was arresting her, if you catch my drift." Mercer slammed his beer mug down, foam sloshing onto the table. "I knew it. I knew he was soft on them. But this sleeping with a squaw, it is disgusting." Silas finally looked up. His eyes were cold, calculating, devoid of the moral outrage Mercer was feigning. He saw angles. He saw leverage. "This is an opportunity. Mr. Mercer," Silas said smoothly. "A distinct opportunity." "Opportunity," Mercer spat. "It is a disgrace to the badge." "It is a weapon," Silas corrected. "Sheriff Cole has positioned himself as the moral compass of this town. He refuses to sell the land because of his principles. But if the town believes their sheriff is in bed with the very savage who has been cutting their fences and stealing their livestock, well, principles tend to crumble under the weight of public scandal." Mercer's eyes narrowed, a cruel smile forming We tell the town. We let them know their protector is traitorous filth. We do more than tell them, Silas said, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. We amplify it. We make sure every church-going woman and every hard-working man in Redstone knows that while they sleep in fear of Indian raids, their sheriff is out at the lake, frolicking with the enemy. Silas reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a $20 gold piece. He slid it across the table to Jeb. You have a big mouth. Jeb, go use it. Buy drinks. Tell your story. Embellish it. Make it vivid. Jeb snatched the coin, grinning. Yes, sir, Mr. Harlow. I will make sure they hear it all. As Jeb hurried toward the bar, Silas turned back to Mercer. Once the town turns on him, Cole will be isolated. He will be desperate, and a desperate man is much easier to negotiate with. The lake will be ours, deputy, and once Cole is out of the way, I imagine the position of a sheriff will be vacant. Mercer sat back, visualizing the tin star on his own chest. I will make sure he regrets the day he ever looked at that woman. Night came to Redstone again, but the air felt heavier than before. The wind had picked up, rattling the loose shutters of the sheriff's office. Ethan stood on the small balcony at the back of the building, the one that faced the distant, dark silhouette of the mountains. He held a lit cigarette in his hand, watching the smoke curl up into the darkness. He had spent the afternoon dealing with a broken axle on a wagon in the main street, but he had felt the eyes on him. They felt different today, sharper. There were whispers that stopped when he walked by, laughter that felt aimed at his back. He did not know yet what Jeb had started, but he could feel the shift in the atmosphere, like the drop in pressure before a tornado touched down. His mind, however, kept drifting back to the lake. He closed his eyes and saw her again. Naya. The water glistened on her skin, the fire in her eyes, the knife in her hand. He had gone to the lake to find peace, to wash away the memories of war. Instead, he had found something far more volatile. He felt a gnawing guilt in his gut. He was a sheriff, sworn to uphold the law of the territory, a law that viewed Naya and her people as obstacles to be removed. And yet, when he thought of the lake now, he didn't think of water rights or treaties. He thought of her. Damn it, Ethan whispered into the night. He flicked the cigarette butt over the railing. It sparked as it hit the ground and died. He realized then that the solitude he had carefully built around himself for 5 years had been breached. The lake was no longer just water and rock. It was a meeting ground. It was a battlefield. And as he looked out toward the invisible line where the town ended and the wild began, Ethan Cole knew 2 things with absolute certainty. First, Silas Harlow and Hank Mercer were plotting something that would bring fire to this valley. And second, he wanted to see the ghost warrior again. The peace was gone. The war for the soul of Redstone had begun. And whether he liked it or not, the woman in the water was at the center of it. The question was no longer if he could avoid the conflict, but which side of the line he would stand on when the shooting started. The smell of death hung heavy over the valley floor, a sweet and cloying scent that mingled with the acrid odor of creosote and coal smoke. It had been 3 days since the incident at the lake, and the peace sheriff Ethan Cole had tried so desperately to maintain was fraying like an old rope under too much tension. Ethan crouched beside the carcass of an ox, his boots sinking into the red dust. The animal lay on its side, bloated in the afternoon sun, 2 arrows protruding from its flank. 50 yards away, a section of the newly laid iron rail had been pried loose, the wooden ties split and burned. Navajo arrows, Deputy Hank Mercer said, standing a few feet back, a handkerchief pressed to his nose. Clear as day. Sheriff, they came down in the night, slaughtered the stock, and wrecked the company property. Silas Harlow is going to want heads for this. Ethan did not answer immediately. He reached out and grasped the shaft of one of the arrows. It was indeed fletched with the turkey feathers common to the Red Elk tribe, but something about the angle bothered him. The shot had been messy, not a clean kill, and the tracks around the beast had been scoured away, not by wind, but by someone dragging brush over the sand. Maybe, Ethan said, standing up and dusting off his hands. Or maybe someone wants it to look that way. You are blind, Mercer spat, holstering his gun. Or maybe you just do not want to see it because of your little swim at the lake. Ethan turned on him, his eyes cold. Careful, Hank. The town is talking. Ethan, they say you are letting them run wild because you have a soft spot for the savages. Go back to town, Ethan ordered, his voice low and dangerous. Tell the foreman to get a cleanup crew out here. I will track the rest of the perimeter. Mercer held his gaze for a moment, a sneer curling his lip. Before he turned and mounted his horse, Ethan watched him ride away, the deputy's figure disappearing into the heat haze. He waited until he was truly alone before he mounted his own horse, Buster, and rode not toward the town, but toward the ridge of sandstone that overlooked the wreckage. He did not have to wait long. He sensed her before he saw her. The birds in the scrub brush went silent, and the hair on the back of his neck stood up. Ethan kept his hands visible on the pommel of his saddle. You can come out. Naya, he called out to the rocks. I am alone. She emerged from behind a twisted juniper tree, and Ethan felt a jolt of recognition that had nothing to do with the law. She looked different than she had in the water. Today, she was dressed for war. She wore a tunic of cured deer hide reinforced with hardened leather strips, and her legs were wrapped in leggings that protected her from the cactus spines. A quiver of arrows was strapped to her back, and the Colt revolver she had taken from a soldier hung at her hip. Paint red and black marked her cheekbones. She did not look like a woman bathing. She looked like the spirit of vengeance the town whispered about. You lawmen make too much noise, Naya said, her voice flat. She remained on the rock above him, holding the high ground. Did your people do this? Ethan asked, gesturing toward the dead ox below. If I had killed the beast, I would have taken the meat, Naya replied. We do not kill for sport, and we do not leave food to rot in the sun. That is the way of the white man. Ethan studied her face. There was anger there. Yes, but no deception. The arrows are red elk. Arrows can be stolen. Or bought, she said. Just as badges can be bought. Ethan sighed, taking off his hat to wipe the sweat from his brow. Silas Harlow claims this is an act of war. He is petitioning the territorial governor for soldiers. If they come, Naya, they will sweep this entire valley. They will not care who killed the ox. They will burn your village. Let them come, Naya said, her hand drifting to her knife. We know these canyons. They will die of thirst before they find us. And your elders, the children, Ethan pressed. Can they outrun the cavalry? Can they outrun the winter that is coming? Naya hesitated. The defiance in her posture softened just a fraction. He had struck a nerve. I can stop the soldiers, Ethan said, his voice earnest. But I need you to give me something. No more cutting the rails. No more scaring the workers. Give me 2 weeks to prove that Silas is lying. Why should I trust you? Naya asked, stepping down from the rock, moving closer to his horse. You serve them. I serve the law, Ethan corrected. And right now, the law is being twisted. If you stop the attacks, I will ensure that the railway surveyors do not cross the marker stones of your ancestors' graves. I will keep them away from the lake. Naya looked at him, searching his face for the lie. She saw the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the same ones she had seen at the lake. She remembered how he had turned his back to give her dignity. A paper promise? She asked skeptically. No paper, Ethan said. My word, man to warrior. It was a dangerous offer. He was making a treaty he had no legal authority to make, based solely on his instinct that this woman was not the villain the town believed her to be. Naya was silent for a long time. The wind whistled through the canyon, carrying the sound of the distant hammers on the rails. 2 weeks, she said finally. If a single boot touches the burial grounds, the deal is broken, and I will not miss next time. Agreed, Ethan said. She turned to leave, then paused. The ox was killed by a man with a limp. His tracks were heavy on the left side. I saw them before the wind rose. Before Ethan could thank her, she vanished into the landscape, leaving him alone with the dead animal and a promise that hung around his neck like a noose. The atmosphere in Redstone had shifted from tension to a simmering hostility. When Ethan rode back into town, the silence that greeted him was heavy. Men stopped their conversations on the boardwalk to watch him pass. Women pulled their children closer. He tied Buster in front of his office and walked inside, only to find Silas Harlow sitting at his desk. The railroad man was immaculate in his black suit, looking entirely out of place amidst the dust and stacks of wanted posters. "You're in my chair, Mr. Harlow," Ethan said, hanging his hat on the rack. "It is a comfortable chair," Silas said, smiling without warmth. He did not stand up. "I assume you have caught the savages responsible for the destruction of my property?" "I am investigating," Ethan said, "but I have reason to believe it was not the tribe." Silas chuckled, a dry sound like shifting gravel. "Of course you do. Always the defender of the downtrodden. Tell me, Sheriff, have you seen this?" Silas slid a folded document across the desk. Ethan picked it up. It was a court order from the district judge in Santa Fe, stamped with the official seal of the territory. "Eminent domain," Silas said, savoring the words. "It declares the body of water known as Coles Lake, a public utility essential for the expansion of commerce and transport. It effectively transfers management of the water rights to the Western Iron Line." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face, replaced instantly by a flash of rage. "This is illegal. That is private land, my land. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few," Silas quoted mockingly. "The territory needs the railroad. The railroad needs water." The judge, a very reasonable man with whom I had dinner last week, agreed. "Of course, there is a compensation package. It is quite generous, far more than the land is worth." "You bribed him," Ethan said flatly. "I facilitated progress," Silas corrected, standing up and smoothing his coat. "The order goes into effect in 10 days. I expect you to have vacated the premises and removed any obstacles, including the locals who seem to think they own the place." "I will fight this," Ethan said, crumpling the paper in his fist. "With what money?" Silas asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You are a sheriff in a dying town." "I own the bank that holds your mortgage. I own the judge, and judging by the look in Deputy Mercer's eyes, I suspect I will soon own the law in this town too." Silas walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "Do not be a martyr. Cole, nobody remembers them. Take the money. Leave, before the wheels turn over you." Ethan stood in the empty office, the crumpled paper burning his hand. He looked out the window, across the street, standing in the shadow of the saloon. Hank Mercer was talking to a group of miners. He pointed at the sheriff's office, then spat on the ground. The men laughed. Ethan realized then that the isolation he had felt for years was no longer a choice. It was a cage being built around him, bar by bar. 3 days later, the fragile peace shattered. Ethan was patrolling the North Ridge, checking the pass where the supply wagons usually came through from the capital. The sun was beginning to dip, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and orange. He heard the gunfire before he saw it. It was the sharp crack of repeating rifles, echoing off the canyon walls. Ethan spurred Buster into a gallop, tearing down the trail toward the valley floor. He came upon a chaotic scene. A Western Iron Line supply wagon had been overturned, its wheels spinning in the air. Crates of dynamite and tools were scattered across the sand. 3 men were pinned down behind the wagon, firing wildly into the rocks above. "Help, we are pinned down!" one of the men screamed as he saw Ethan approach. Ethan vaulted off his horse, drawing his Winchester rifle. He slid into cover behind a large boulder. "Who is shooting?" "Indians!" the driver yelled. "A whole war party!" Ethan squinted at the rocks. He saw muzzle flashes, but no arrows. The attackers were using Henry repeating rifles, expensive guns, not the trade muskets or bows the Red Elk usually carried, and they were shouting instructions to one another in English. "Flank him on the left." "Keep his head down." Ethan's gut twisted. This was not a raid. It was a stage play, performed with lethal bullets. "Identify yourselves," Ethan shouted, firing a warning shot near the rocks. "This is Sheriff Cole." The answer was a hail of lead that chipped the rock inches from his face, sending stone splinters into his cheek. "We do not care who you are," a voice shouted back. Ethan was pinned. He counted at least 6 attackers. Holding the high ground, the wagon drivers were useless. Huddled in fear, he pumped the lever of his Winchester, firing twice, but he was losing the angle. A bullet struck the dirt near his boot, then another grazed his arm, tearing the fabric of his shirt. He was going to die here. It was a simple calculation. They had the numbers, the position, and the firepower. Then, from the ridge far above the attackers, a different sound cut through the noise. It was the hum of a bowstring, followed by a wet thud. One of the gunmen on the rock stood up, clawing at an arrow in his neck, before tumbling down the slope. Confusion erupted among the attackers. Where did that come from? Another arrow flew, striking a second man in the thigh. Naya Red Elk appeared on the ridge line, silhouetted against the setting sun. She moved like a mountain cat, leaping from rock to rock, firing her bow with terrifying speed. "Cover me!" Ethan yelled to the drivers, though he knew they would not. He broke cover, sprinting toward a cluster of mesquite closer to the enemy flank. He fired as he ran, taking down a man who had turned his rifle toward Naya. Naya dropped her bow and drew her revolver as the distance closed. She slid down a scree slope, landing in a crouch 10 yards from Ethan. "You look like you need help, lawman," she shouted over the gunfire. "I thought we had a deal," Ethan yelled back, firing a round that sent a bandit scrambling. "These are not my people." Naya replied, firing 2 shots that took the hat off a gunman. "These men smell of stale whiskey and city soap." They were fighting back to back now. Ethan firing toward the north, Naya toward the south. It was a desperate, frantic dance. They moved with a strange synchronization, as if they had fought together 100 times before. When Ethan reloaded, Naya covered him. When Naya moved to a new position, Ethan laid down suppressive fire. "On your right!" Naya screamed. Ethan spun, firing from the hip. A man who had crept up through the brush dropped his shotgun and fell, clutching his chest. But in the moment of distraction, another gunman on the ridge took aim at Ethan. Naya saw it. She threw herself at Ethan, shoving him hard. The bullet meant for his heart caught him in the meat of his shoulder instead. The impact spun him around, and he hit the ground hard, his rifle skittering away. Naya stood over him, her face a mask of fury. She raised her Colt and fired the last 3 rounds in the cylinder with deadly precision. The gunman on the ridge jerked backward and went still. Silence fell over the canyon, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the heavy breathing of the 2 warriors. The remaining attackers, realizing the tide had turned, scrambled back to their horses and fled into the twilight. Ethan tried to sit up, but the world swam. His shoulder was on fire. "Stay down," Naya commanded, kneeling beside him. Her hands, usually so steady with a weapon, were gentle as she pressed a piece of cloth against his wound. You came back," Ethan gasped, the pain making his vision gray. "I told you," Naya said, her eyes scanning the horizon for more threats. "I watched the perimeter. I saw them waiting for the wagon." She looked down at him, her dark eyes wide. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a raw, electric intensity between them. They were covered in dust and sweat, surrounded by death. Yet Ethan had never felt more alive. "We cannot stay here," Naya said. "More will come." She whistled, a sharp, piercing sound. Her paint horse trotted out from the shadows. She helped Ethan stand, taking his weight without complaint. "My horse," Ethan mumbled. "He will follow," Naya said. "I am taking you to the old caves. It is the only safe place." The cave was cool and smelled of dry earth and ancient fires. A small fire crackled near the entrance, shielded from the outside view by a wall of rock. Ethan sat leaning against the stone wall, his shirt removed. The bullet had passed clean through the flesh of his shoulder, missing the bone, but he had lost a significant amount of blood. Naya was crushing dried leaves and roots in a stone bowl. She mixed them with a little water from her canteen to make a poultice. "This will sting," she warned. She pressed the green paste into the wound. Ethan hissed through his teeth, his hand gripping his knee until the knuckles turned white. "Breathe," Naya whispered. She began to wrap his shoulder with strips of clean cloth she had torn from her own spare tunic. As she worked, her hands brushed against his chest. Ethan watched her in the flickering firelight. He saw the focus in her eyes, the way her hair fell across her face. "You have many scars," Naya said softly, her fingers tracing an old, jagged line across his ribs, a souvenir from a Confederate saber. "Reminders," Ethan said, his voice raspy. "Of mistakes. A scar is not a mistake," Naya said, tying off the bandage. "It is proof that you survived." She sat back on her heels, wiping her hands. For the first time, Ethan noticed the tattoo on her neck, just below her ear. It was a small, intricate design of a hawk in flight, inked in blue. "And that?" Ethan asked, gesturing to the mark. Naya touched the spot self-consciously. "It marks me as a protector, one who watches from above." "You did that today," Ethan said. "You saved my life. Naya, why?" Naya looked away, toward the wall of the cave. The firelight illuminated the ancient petroglyphs etched into the stone by her ancestors centuries ago. There was a drawing of a wolf and a wild horse, standing on opposite sides of a stream, drinking the same water. "Because you are the only one standing between the iron snake and the water," she said, though her voice lacked its usual hardness. "And because, when you looked at me in the lake, you did not look with greed." Ethan reached out with his good hand, his fingers brushing against her arm. Her skin was warm, alive. She did not pull away. "We are in trouble, Naya," Ethan said quietly. "Those men today, they were hired guns. Mercer and Silas staged this. They wanted me dead, and they wanted it to look like your people did it. Then we are both hunted," Naya said. She turned to look at him. The distance between them was less than a foot, in the small, enclosed space of the cave. The air felt charged. The smell of sage and blood and sweat was intoxicating. Ethan looked at her lips. He wanted to kiss her. It was a desire so strong it eclipsed the pain in his shoulder. He saw the same question in her eyes, a curiosity, a longing that defied the laws of their separate worlds. But Naya pulled back, just an inch. "We are not the same. Ethan Cole," she whispered, using his full name for the first time. "You are the horse that accepts the saddle. I am the wolf that runs." Ethan glanced at the painting on the wall. "Maybe the horse and the wolf can drink from the same stream, only until the water runs dry," Naya said sadly. She stood up, moving away from the warmth of the fire and the man. "Sleep. I will keep watch." The return to Redstone the next morning was a grim procession. Ethan rode with his arm in a sling, his face pale but set in stone. He had sent Naya back to the hills before dawn, knowing that if they were seen riding in together now, after the attack, it would be a death sentence for her. When he rode down the main street, Deputy Mercer was standing on the porch of the office, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. His eyes widened in genuine shock when he saw Ethan alive. "Sheriff," Mercer called out, forcing a smile that looked like a grimace. "We heard shooting. We thought—" "You thought I was dead," Ethan said, sliding off his horse with difficulty. He walked up the steps, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. He stopped inches from Mercer's face. "It was a bandit raid." "Hank," Ethan said loudly, so the people on the street could hear. "White men, hired guns. They attacked the company wagon." "White men," Mercer stammered. "But the arrows. Arrows can be bought." Ethan repeated Naya's words. "I killed 2 of them. You can send the Undertaker to fetch them." And Hank, "Yeah, if I find out who paid them," Ethan said, his voice dropping to a whisper that chilled Mercer to the bone. "I will not arrest them. I will bury them." Ethan pushed past him into the office. He was alive. He had a temporary ally in the Ghost Warrior. But as he looked at the empty jail cell and the pile of paperwork on his desk, he knew the truth. The peace was gone. He had signed a treaty in blood with a woman the town hated, and he had declared war on the most powerful man in the territory. Up in the high hills, Naya sat by the embers of her own fire. The young warriors of her tribe looked at her with suspicion. They smelled the scent of the white man on her clothes. "He is using you," one of them spat. Naya touched the spot on her arm where Ethan had touched her. "No," she whispered to herself. "He is not." But the doubt was there, a cold seed in her stomach. They were both walking on a razor's edge, and the drop on either side was a long way down. The morning air was usually crisp in the high desert, but today it carried the heavy, sweet scent of rot on the muddy bank of the lake, just where the reeds gave way to the hard-packed red clay. A body lay twisted in the dirt. Sheriff Ethan Cole stood over the corpse, his jaw set so hard it ached. The dead man was a surveyor for the Western Iron Line, a man named O'Malley, who had a wife back in St. Louis, protruding from his chest. Stark against the blood-soaked linen of his shirt was a single arrow. The fletching was unmistakable, the red and black pattern of the Red Elk tribe. "I told you," Deputy Hank Mercer said, his voice loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "I told you they were savages. First the livestock, now a Christian man." Ethan did not look at Mercer. He crouched down, examining the ground. The boot prints around the body were numerous, a chaotic mess of heavy treads. "This ground has been trampled. Hank, who walked here?" "The boys found him an hour ago," Mercer said, gesturing to a group of grim-faced railway workers standing nearby. "They tried to help him, but he was already cold." Ethan touched the arrow shaft. It was loose. It had not been fired with the force of a war bow. It looked as if it had been shoved into the wound after the man had already fallen. And there was no blood spray on the reeds where the arrow would have entered if he had been standing. "This does not look right," Ethan muttered. "Do not start making excuses for them." "Sheriff," a voice rang out. It was the foreman of the rail crew, a burly man with fists like sledgehammers. "That is an Indian arrow. That is a dead white man. You do your job, or we will do it for you." Ethan stood up, facing the crowd. He saw fear in their eyes, but mostly he saw hate. It was a hate that had been carefully stoked, like a fire fed with dry kindling. "I will find who did this," Ethan said, his voice steady. "But we do it by the law. No lynch mobs. No riding out to shoot the first native you see. Is that clear?" The crowd muttered, unhappy with the answer. Mercer smirked, a small, tight expression that vanished as soon as Ethan looked his way. Ethan knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that the evidence did not matter. The arrow was the only story these men wanted to hear. By evening, the mood in Redstone had turned poisonous. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky the color of a fresh bruise. Ethan walked down the main street, feeling the eyes of the town on him. They were no longer the eyes of people looking to their protector. They were the eyes of people looking at a traitor. He pushed through the swinging doors of the saloon. The noise inside died down instantly. The piano player stopped mid-song, his hands hovering over the keys. Ethan walked to the bar. "Whiskey, leave the bottle." The bartender, a man Ethan had known for 5 years, hesitated before sliding a glass and a bottle across the wood. He did not make eye contact. Ethan poured a drink, feeling the burning liquid coat his throat. He looked into the mirror behind the bar and saw a group of miners huddled in the corner, snickering. They were looking at something pinned to the wall near the dartboard. Ethan turned slowly. He walked toward the corner. The men parted, their expressions a mix of defiance and mockery. Pinned to the wall was a crude drawing on a sheet of newsprint. It depicted a caricature of Ethan, his sheriff's badge oversized and ridiculous, frolicking in the water with a grotesque, exaggerated drawing of a native woman. She was naked, and the caption scrawled beneath read, "The Sheriff's Squaw. Justice is blind and naked." The heat rose in Ethan's face, a flush of humiliation and rage that made his hands tremble. It was not just an insult to him. It was a violation of Naya, turning a moment of raw, human connection into something dirty and cheap. He could feel the expectation in the room. They wanted him to draw his gun. They wanted him to shout. Instead, Ethan reached out and ripped the paper from the wall. The sound of tearing paper was loud in the silence. He crumpled it in his fist, his knuckles turning white. He looked at the miners, meeting each man's gaze until they looked away. "If you have something to say," Ethan said, his voice low and scraping like gravel, "say it to my face. Do not draw pictures like children." No one spoke. Ethan turned and walked out, the crumpled paper burning a hole in his palm. He had kept his dignity, but he had lost the town. Miles away, in the shadow of the red cliffs, Naya Red Elk watched smoke rise from the valley floor. It was not a campfire. It was the burning remains of a summer lodge belonging to her cousin. Earlier that afternoon, 3 armed men from the railway company had ridden through the outer perimeter of the tribal lands. They had not killed anyone, but they had set fire to the tent and scattered the horses. Laughing as the women and children screamed, Naya stood on the ridge, her bow in her hand. An arrow nocked and ready. Her heart pounded with a rhythm that demanded blood. She could see the men riding away, well within the range of her shot. She could put a shaft through the neck of the trailing rider. It would be justice. But she lowered the bow. She remembered the cave. She remembered the heat of Ethan's skin under her fingers as she bandaged his wound. She remembered his voice, heavy with exhaustion, promising her that he did not want more blood on this land. "If I shoot," she thought, "I will prove them right. I prove I am the monster they drew on their walls." "Why do you hesitate?" a voice asked behind her. It was Coda, her older brother. He was a fierce warrior, his face painted for war. He looked at the retreating men with pure hatred. "The sheriff asked for time," Naya said quietly. "The sheriff is a white man." Coda spat. "They burn our homes while he talks of law. You are soft, sister. That man has clouded your eyes." "He saved my life," Naya defended, turning to face him. "And I saved him. There is honor in him." "There is no honor in a snake," Coda said. "If you will not fight, I will. The council meets tonight. We will not let them take the lake." Naya watched her brother walk away. She felt a tearing sensation in her chest, as if she were being pulled in 2 directions by wild horses. She was a warrior of the Red Elk, sworn to protect her people. Yet, the wind seemed to whisper Ethan's name, and the thought of him standing alone against his own kind made her heart ache with a terror she had never felt in battle. The next morning brought the breaking point. Ethan rode at the head of a column of 10 men. They were not soldiers, but a deputized posse Mercer had assembled, consisting of hard-eyed men who looked eager for violence. Ethan had no choice. Silas Harlow had demanded an official investigation into the surveyor's death, and if Ethan refused to lead it, Mercer would have led a slaughter. They reached the edge of the Red Elk village just before noon. The dogs barked, and the women gathered the children, retreating into the deeper shelters. The warriors stood in a line, weapons in hand. Ethan raised his hand, signaling the posse to stop. "Keep your hands off your guns," he ordered his men. "We are here to talk." He rode forward alone. Naya stepped out from the line of warriors. She looked at him, and the betrayal in her eyes hit him harder than a bullet. "You bring armed men to our home," Naya said, her voice cold. "Is this your peace, Sheriff?" "A man was killed." "Naya," Ethan said, his voice strained. "An arrow was found. I have to investigate." "I am trying to stop a war, not start one." "By bringing the enemy to our door?" Naya asked. "Search the tents," Mercer shouted from behind Ethan. "Find the quiver that matches the arrow." "Hold your position," Ethan roared, wheeling his horse around. "I give the orders here." But the tension was a dry twig, ready to snap. A young warrior, one of Coda's friends, could not contain his rage. Seeing the white men so close, seeing the sheriff who they believed had betrayed them, he let out a cry and charged forward, raising a stone club. "No!" Naya screamed. Ethan saw the movement. He had a split second to react. He could draw his revolver and shoot the boy. It would be justified. It would be self-defense. Instead, Ethan spurred Buster sideways, letting the horse take the impact of the rush. The club struck the saddle horn, splintering wood. Ethan reached down, grabbing the warrior by the tunic, and flung him backward into the dirt. "Stand down." Ethan shouted, drawing his gun but pointing it at the sky. The posse behind him raised their rifles. The warriors raised their bows. "Stop!" Naya threw herself between the two groups. She stood over the fallen young warrior, her arms spread wide. She looked directly at Ethan. "Leave, now, or the ground will drink blood." Ethan looked at her. He saw the desperation in her stance. He realized that by saving the boy, he had humiliated him, and by bringing these men here, he had destroyed whatever trust he had built with her tribe. "We are leaving," Ethan said, breathless. He turned his horse. "Move out, now!" Mercer looked furious, but he did not dare fire with Naya standing there as a shield. The posse turned and rode back toward town, leaving a cloud of dust and hatred in their wake. As they rode away, Naya turned to help the young warrior up. He slapped her hand away. "You protect him," the boy snarled. "You are no longer a red elk. You are his." Naya stood alone in the center of her village. Her brother turned his back on her. The elders looked away. She had stopped the massacre, but the price had been her place among her people. That night, the moon was a sliver of bone in the black sky. Naya could not sleep. The silence of the village felt like a judgment. She wrapped a thin cotton blanket around herself and walked out into the desert. Her feet knew the path even in the dark. She needed the water. She needed to ask the ancestors why her heart was beating for the enemy. She reached the lake and waded in. The water was cold, shocking her skin, washing away the dust of the confrontation. She did not swim. She just stood there, the water rising to her chest, the thin fabric of the blanket floating around her like a ghostly shroud. "I knew I would find you here." The voice came from the bank. It was quiet, resigned. Naya did not reach for her knife this time. She turned slowly. Ethan stood by the water's edge. He had left his horse further back. He was not wearing his hat. And in the moonlight, he looked younger, more vulnerable. "You should not be here," Naya said. "My brother has watchers in the hills. They will kill you." "Let them," Ethan said. He walked into the water. He was still wearing his boots and trousers, but he did not seem to care. He stopped when the water reached his waist, just a few feet from her. "Why did you come?" Naya asked. Her voice trembled, betraying her warrior's mask. "Because I cannot sleep," Ethan said. "I close my eyes, and I see you standing in front of those rifles. I see the way your people look at you. They look at me with shame," Naya whispered. "Because of you." "I know," Ethan said. He took a step closer. The water rippled between them, connecting them. "I am sorry. Naya, I am sorry for the drawing in the saloon. I am sorry for the posse. I am sorry that I have brought this storm to your door." "Sorry does not stop bullets," Naya said. "No," Ethan agreed. "It does not, but I had to tell you. I have lost my peace ever since that first day. When I saw you here, nothing fits anymore. My badge feels heavy. The town feels foreign. The only time I feel like I am breathing is when I am near you." Naya looked up at him. The moonlight reflected in his eyes, showing a depth of honesty that frightened her. "You scare me, Ethan Cole," she admitted, her voice barely audible over the lap of the water. "Not your gun, not your laws. You scare me because you make me want to believe that a white man can be something other than a destroyer." Ethan reached out, his hand hovering near her face. "I want to be the man who protects you, not the sheriff. Just the man." Naya did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, her cheek pressing against his rough palm. It was a surrender, a laying down of arms that terrified them both. "Then show me," she whispered. Ethan closed the distance. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not the rough, hungry kiss of a saloon romance. It was tentative at first, a question asked and answered. His lips were warm, tasting of tobacco and coffee. Her lips were cool, tasting of the lake. Then, the dam broke. Ethan wrapped his arms around her, pulling her wet body against his. Naya gripped the front of his shirt, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to him. For a moment, there was no railroad, no angry town, no looming war. There was only the sensation of two shipwrecked souls finding land. They broke apart slowly, breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. Naya pulled back slightly, her hands resting on his chest, right over his heart. She looked him in the eye, her expression fierce and solemn. "Listen to me, Ethan," she said, her voice steady. "If you cannot save this lake, if you cannot stop the iron snake from drinking this water, then do not touch me again. I cannot be with the man who lets my world die." Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of her condition. "I will save it. I swear it." The following morning, the reality of the world crashed back in with brutal force. Ethan sat in his office, staring at a document Silas Harlow had had delivered by a courier at dawn. It was the eminent domain order. He held it up to the light. The seal was real. The signature of the governor was real. But the date was wrong. It was dated 3 months ago, before the railway had even surveyed the southern pass. It was a forgery, backdated to bypass the legal appeal period. "Clever bastard," Ethan whispered. "Talking to yourself." "Sheriff." Ethan looked up. Silas Harlow stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 men Ethan did not recognize. They wore long dusters, but the way they moved told Ethan they were professional gunmen. "This order is a lie," Ethan said, standing up. "It is a legal document," Silas replied smoothly, "and it will be enforced. Federal troops are on their way from Fort Wingate. They will be here in 2 days to ensure the eviction of all trespassers from the water source. That includes you, Cole." Silas stepped closer, his voice dropping to a serpentine hiss. "And just to be safe, I have hired some additional security. Mr. Mercer has been very helpful in locating men who specialize in pest control." Ethan looked at the gunman. He realized then that the security was not here to guard the train. They were here to ensure a massacre. If the troops arrived and found a peaceful tribe, there would be a standoff. But if the troops arrived and found a battle already raging started by savages, they would join the slaughter without question. "You are going to kill them all," Ethan said, his blood running cold. "Men, women, children." "I am going to build a railroad," Silas said. "Whatever stands in the way is merely debris." Silas turned to leave. "You have 24 hours to vacate the property, Sheriff. After that, you are just another squatter." Ethan watched them go. He checked the load in his Colt. He checked the Winchester in the rack. Up in the hills, the drums began to beat. Naya stood on the overlook, watching the dust cloud of the approaching riders on the horizon. The tribe was packing up, preparing to retreat deep into the mountains where they would starve in the coming winter. "We must go, sister," Coda urged her, pulling at her arm. "The soldiers are coming." Naya pulled her arm free. She looked down at the blue eye of the lake. She touched her lips, where the ghost of Ethan's kiss still lingered. "No," Naya said. "I am not leaving." "Then you will die alone," Coda said. "Then I die guarding the water," she replied. "Down in the valley." Ethan Cole pinned his badge onto his vest. It felt heavier than lead. He walked out of his office, mounted his horse, and looked toward the lake. The water had risen to his neck. He could no longer stand in the middle. He had to choose, and as he spurred his horse into a gallop, he knew that his choice would likely cost him his life. But for the first time in years, as he rode toward the woman who waited by the water, he did not feel lost. He felt found. The dawn broke not with the promise of a new day, but with the ominous rumble of approaching violence. The sky was a bruised purple, slowly bleeding into a harsh, unforgiving orange as the sun clawed its way over the eastern horizon. Sheriff Ethan Cole rode near the front of the column, though he was not leading it. That honor belonged to Captain Josiah Reed, a man whose cavalry uniform was too clean and whose eyes were too empty. Beside him rode Silas Harlow, seated comfortably in a reinforced carriage, checking his pocket watch as if he were timing a train arrival rather than an eviction. Behind them trailed a snake of 20 hired guns, men with dusters and low-slung holsters, and a platoon of federal soldiers who looked tired and dusty, dragged from their barracks by the weight of Harlow's political influence. They carried surveying equipment, heavy rolls of barbed wire, and crates of dynamite. Ethan felt the sick weight of his badge against his chest. He was being paraded like a prize steer, a symbol of local law to legitimize what was essentially an invasion. Deputy Hank Mercer rode close to his flank, his hand hovering constantly near his gun, his eyes darting around with a mixture of paranoia and malicious glee. "Big day, Sheriff," Mercer sneered, his voice low. "Finally going to clean out the trash?" Ethan did not look at him. His eyes were fixed on the red cliffs that surrounded the basin of the lake. He knew they were there. He could feel them. The silence of the canyon was too deep, the lack of birdsong too absolute. "This is a mistake, Silas," Ethan said, raising his voice so the soldiers could hear. "The order is a forgery. You are marching these men into a crime." Silas leaned out of his carriage, smiling thinly. "The ink is dry, Cole, and the governor's seal is red. That is all the truth the world needs." They reached the narrow pass that opened up into the lake basin. The water shimmered in the distance, a jewel of impossible blue amidst the red rock. Ethan pulled on Buster's reins, bringing the massive horse to a halt. The column bumped and stuttered to a stop behind him. "Why are we stopping?" Captain Reed demanded. Riding up, Ethan turned his horse to face them. He looked at the soldiers, young men who thought they were serving their country, and the mercenaries who only served gold. "I will go no further," Ethan announced, his voice booming off the canyon walls. "And neither should you. This land belongs to the Red Elk people by a treaty signed 20 years ago. The document, mister. Harlow holds as a lie. If you cross this line, you are not upholding the law. You are breaking it." "He is delirious," Silas shouted, standing up in his carriage. "He has been compromised by the savages, Captain. Remove him." "You heard the man," Mercer hissed, spurring his horse forward. "Step aside, Ethan, or I will put you down right here." Mercer's hand was already moving. He wasn't going to arrest Ethan. He was going to stage an accident. Ethan saw the glint of the nickel-plated revolver clearing leather, but before Mercer could level the weapon, a high-pitched whistle cut through the air. From the rim of the canyon, 300 feet above, a massive boulder, pushed by unseen hands, tipped over the edge. It crashed down with the sound of thunder, slamming into the earth just 10 feet in front of the lead cavalry horse. The ground shook. Dust exploded upward, blinding and choking the lead riders. "Ambush!" Captain Reed screamed. "Take cover!" The cliffs suddenly came alive. Coda Red Elk stood on a high promontory, raising his bow. Beside him, dozens of warriors emerged from the camouflage of the rock. They did not fire into the mass of men. Instead, they fired at the ground, at the wheels of the carriage, and into the air. It was a strategy of chaos, not slaughter. An arrow struck the yoke of the supply wagon, causing the oxen to panic and twist, overturning the cart. Crates of wooden stakes spilled out, blocking the retreat. Another arrow took the hat right off Silas Harlow's head, pinning it to the seat of his carriage. The railroad tycoon shrieked, scrambling down into the dirt, his dignity vanishing instantly. "Fire, kill them all!" Silas screamed from beneath the carriage. The mercenaries did not need to be told twice. They opened fire on the cliffs, their Winchester rifles cracking sharply. The soldiers, trained to react to contact, began to form a firing line, aiming their carbines upward. "Stop!" Ethan shouted, trying to control his skittish horse. "Cease fire! They are not shooting to kill!" But his voice was lost in the roar of battle, the air filled with the whine of ricochets and the smell of gunpowder. Ethan saw Naya then. She was lower down the slope than the others, moving fast through the scree. She was firing her revolver, aiming for the mercenaries who were setting up a defensive position behind the dead horses. She was fighting to protect the water, just as she had sworn. "There she is!" Mercer yelled. He had dismounted and was using his horse as a shield. He raised his rifle, sighting not on the warriors above, but specifically on Naya. Ethan saw the barrel stabilize. He saw Mercer's finger tighten. Ethan did not think. He launched himself from his saddle, tackling Mercer just as the rifle went off. The bullet went wide, chipping stone feet away from Naya. The two men hit the red dust hard, rolling over each other. Mercer was wiry and quick, fueled by hate. He drove a knee into Ethan's ribs and clawed for his pistol. "Traitor!" Mercer screamed, spit flying from his mouth. "I should have killed you in your sleep." Ethan blocked a punch and landed a heavy blow to Mercer's jaw. "You sold this town, Hank! You sold your soul!" They scrambled to their feet, circling each other amidst the chaos of the battle. Around them, horses screamed and men shouted orders. An arrow thudded into the ground between them. Mercer drew a long hunting knife. "Silas paid me $500 to put that arrow in the surveyor's chest," Mercer snarled, his voice manic. "And he will pay me double to bring him your ears." The confession hung in the air, heard by the nearest soldiers who were taking cover nearby. Ethan drew his own knife, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You admit it! You killed O'Malley!" "I did what had to be done." Mercer lunged. Ethan stepped aside, parrying the blow with his forearm, feeling the steel slice through his shirt and skin. He ignored the pain. He grabbed Mercer's wrist, twisting it violently while driving his shoulder into the deputy's chest. They went down again, but this time Ethan was on top. He pinned Mercer's knife hand to the dirt. Mercer thrashed, bucking like a wild horse, his other hand grasping for a rock. Ethan slammed his fist into Mercer's face. Once, twice. The fight went out of the deputy. Ethan wrenched the knife from Mercer's grip and tossed it away. He grabbed Mercer by the collar, dragging him close. "You are done, Hank," Ethan growled. "It is over." But the battle was not over. On the cliffside, the soldiers had found their range. A volley of carbine fire swept the ridge. Naya had moved into the open to get a better shot at a mercenary who was flanking her position. She did not see the soldier aiming from the cover of the overturned wagon. "Naya, move!" Ethan screamed, abandoning the unconscious Mercer. She turned too late, but Coda had seen it. The war chief leaped from his cover, throwing his body between the rifle and his sister. The crack of the carbine was sickeningly loud. Coda jerked violently as the heavy lead slug took him in the chest. He collapsed backward, sliding down the loose shale of the slope. "No!" Naya's scream tore through the noise of the battle, a sound of pure, raw agony. She dropped her gun and slid down the slope, heedless of the bullets flying around her. She reached her brother just as he hit the flat ground near the water's edge. The sight of the fallen chief and the grieving woman seemed to freeze the battlefield. The warriors on the cliff stopped firing, watching in horror. The soldiers, seeing their target down, lowered their weapons, unsure of whether to continue the slaughter. Ethan ran to them. He fell to his knees beside Naya. She was pressing her hands against Coda's chest, trying to hold the life inside him, but the blood was dark and flowing fast. Coda's eyes were open, staring up at the blue sky he had fought to protect. He looked at Naya, his hand trembling as he reached up to touch her face. "Do not let them drink," Coda rasped, blood bubbling at his lips. He turned his gaze to Ethan. The animosity was gone, replaced by a desperate plea. "Hold the water together." Coda Red Elk exhaled a long, rattling breath, and then he was still. Naya froze. For a moment, she was a statue carved from grief. Then, a wail rose from her throat, a sound so primal and full of sorrow that it silenced the men on both sides. Ethan felt a tear trace a path through the dust on his face. He looked at the dead man, then at the soldiers who stood uncomfortably shifting their feet. He looked at the mercenaries who were reloading their weapons. Indifferent to the tragedy, rage, cold and absolute, filled him. He stood up. Silas Harlow had crawled out from under his carriage, seeing the chief dead and the sheriff distracted. He was trying to scramble onto one of the loose horses, clutching his leather satchel of documents. "Leaving so soon? Silas!" Ethan's voice was dead calm. Silas froze. He looked at Ethan. He saw a man who had shed civilization and found something harder underneath. "The natives attacked us," Silas shrilled, pointing a shaking finger at the cliffs. "I am a victim here. This is a massacre." Ethan walked toward him. He did not run. He walked with the inevitable momentum of a landslide. "Stay back. Cole." Silas fumbled inside his coat and pulled out a small Derringer pistol. "I represent the Western Iron Line. I represent the future." You represent nothing but greed and a shallow grave, Ethan said. Silas fired. The small bullet pinged off Ethan's belt buckle. Harmless. Ethan did not flinch. He reached Silas and slapped the gun out of his hand with a backhand blow that sent the tycoon spinning into the mud. Ethan grabbed Silas by the lapels of his expensive suit and slammed him against the wood of the carriage wheel. "Look," Ethan commanded, forcing Silas's head toward the body of Coda Red Elk. "Look at what your progress costs." "It is unfortunate," Silas stammered, blood trickling from his lip. "But necessary. The law." "I am the law," Ethan roared, shaking him. He reached into Silas's satchel and pulled out the eminent domain order. He held it up for the captain and the soldiers to see. "This document is dated 3 months ago," Ethan announced, "before the survey was even filed. It is a fraud, and Deputy Mercer just confessed to the murder of your surveyor, O'Malley, on this man's orders." Captain Reed stepped forward, his pistol lowered. "Is that true, Sheriff? Mercer is lying in the dirt over there," Ethan said, throwing Silas to the ground. "Ask him when he wakes up, or check his pockets. I bet you find the gold Silas paid him." Silas scrambled backward through the mud, looking for an ally. "Captain, arrest this man. He is conspiring with the enemy." Captain Reed looked at the dead chief. He looked at Naya, who was now standing up, her face a mask of stone. Holding her brother's knife, he looked at Ethan, who stood unarmed but terrifying. "My men are soldiers, Mr. Harlow," Captain Reed said coldly. "Not executioners. If the order is fake, my jurisdiction ends." Reed signaled his men. "Stand down. Secure the prisoners. Someone ties up the deputy." The mercenaries, sensing the wind changing and seeing that their paymaster was in the mud, began to holster their weapons and drift away, disappearing back toward the pass. Ethan turned back to the lake. The fighting had stopped. The silence returned, but it was heavy now, weighted with the dead. He walked over to where Naya stood. She was trembling, staring at Coda. Ethan reached up to his chest. His fingers closed around the tin star that had defined his life for 5 years. It was stained with dust and sweat. It felt cold. He unpinned it. He looked at the badge, then at the soldiers, and finally at Naya. "If this badge protects men like Silas and kills men like Coda," Ethan said, his voice carrying in the stillness, "then it is not the law. It is just metal." He threw the badge. It spun through the air, flashing in the sun, before splashing into the mud at the edge of the lake, sinking into the red clay. Naya looked at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, but she saw the act. She saw him cast aside his shield, his identity, his protection. He had chosen. He stood between her and the soldiers, unarmed, with nothing but his hands and his word. The sky, which had been threatening all morning, finally broke. A single drop of rain hit the dust, then another. Within seconds, a desert squall opened up, pouring water down from the heavens. The rain was cool and clean. It hammered against the dry earth, turning the dust to mud. It washed the blood from Coda's chest. It ran down Ethan's face, mingling with sweat and tears. It soaked Silas Harlow, who sat shivering in the mud, bound by his own belt. Ethan stepped closer to Naya. He did not touch her. He gave her the space she needed. He simply stood beside her, a sentinel in the rain. "He asked us to hold the water," Ethan said softly. Naya looked at him, water streaming down her dark hair. She nodded slowly. "Then we hold it." The water of the lake began to rise with the rain, lapping gently at their boots, cleansing the ground where the battle had been fought. There was no victory celebration. There was no cheering. There was only the rain, the dead, and the two of them standing on the edge of two worlds that had violently collided and were now, finally, beginning to merge. The rain that had washed the blood from the red clay of the basin had long since evaporated, leaving the earth cracked and dry once more. But the storm that had swept through Redstone had left marks that no sun could bake away. 2 weeks after the battle at the lake, the Santa Fe New Mexican ran a headline that shocked the territory's railroad baron indicted for fraud and murder conspiracy. The trial had been swift. Driven by the damning testimony of Captain Josiah Reed and the undeniable evidence of the forged documents Ethan Cole had pulled from Silas Harlow's satchel, Silas, stripped of his fine suits and his arrogance, sat in a cell awaiting transport to a federal penitentiary. Deputy Hank Mercer, broken both physically and in spirit, had turned state's evidence to avoid the hangman's noose, spilling every dirty secret of the Western Iron Line's operations in the county. Ethan Cole was no longer sheriff. He had walked out of the courthouse a free man, but a man without a title. The badge he had thrown into the mud remained there, buried somewhere beneath the reeds of the lake, a relic of a life he had outgrown. The town of Redstone was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. The fear that had hung over the streets like a shroud had lifted. The railway construction had halted, the crews unpaid and drifting away to other boom towns. In the saloon, the piano played a slow, melancholy tune. The bartender, a man named Tom who had once laughed at the crude drawing on the wall, took down the old wanted poster for the Ghost Warrior. In its place, he pinned up a small, hand-painted landscape of the lake at sunset. It was a clumsy painting, done by a local schoolteacher, but the message was clear. The mockery was gone. "He saved us," Tom muttered to a patron as he wiped the bar. If Cole had not stopped them, Silas would have owned every drop of water in this valley by next summer. We would have been buying our own spit from him. Some of the miners still grumbled, calling Ethan a traitor to his race, but they did so in hushed tones. They had seen him walk unarmed toward a firing squad to save a woman. That kind of courage commanded a grudging respect, even from those who hated what he stood for. High in the mountains, the air was thin and cold. Naya Red Elk sat on a ridge overlooking the valley, but her eyes were turned inward. The mourning period for Coda was not yet over. Her hair was cut short in the traditional sign of grief. She had burned his possessions, his bow, his moccasins, his sleeping furs, sending his spirit to the ancestors on the smoke, but the guilt would not burn. "I trusted the white man," she whispered to the wind. "And because of that trust, my brother is dead." The elders had tried to comfort her. They said Coda had chosen his death. They said he had died a warrior, protecting his blood. But Naya saw only the moment the bullet struck him. She saw the light leave his eyes. She could not go back to the lake. The water there was too heavy with memory. Every ripple looked like Coda's last breath. So she had led the remnants of her band deeper into the high country, away from the contact, away from the temptation of peace. She tried to lose herself in the hunt. She led raiding parties against the illegal copper miners who crept into the northern canyons. She struck with a ferocity that frightened even her own warriors. She was trying to outrun the pain, trying to drown the image of Ethan Cole standing in the rain, looking at her with eyes full of sorrow. But he was always there, in the quiet moments before sleep. She saw him throwing his badge away. She felt the ghost of his hand on hers. He had given up everything for her, and she walked away without a word. Ethan Cole sat on the porch of the small cabin he had rented on the edge of town. He was whittling a piece of cedar, the shavings curling around his boots. He was a civilian now. He wore a simple cotton shirt and canvas trousers. The gun belt hung on a peg inside the door, gathering dust. Without the rhythm of the patrols, the days stretched out long and empty. He filled them with work. He helped the widow Miller fix her roof. He repaired the fences for the livery stable. He rode out to chase off a pack of coyotes that were harassing the sheep. He was useful, but he was hollow. The town council had approached him yesterday. They wanted him to run for marshal of the district. "You have the experience, Ethan," the mayor had said. "The people trust you now." Ethan had declined. "I am done with the law. Mayor, the law changes depending on who is holding the pen. I would rather just be a neighbor." But being a neighbor did not stop the dreams. At night, the war nightmares were gone, replaced by something sharper. He dreamed of the lake. He dreamed of Naya. He wondered where she was. He had not seen her since the day of the battle. He respected her grief. He knew that to her, he was a reminder of the tragedy. "She blames you," he told himself in the dark. "And she is right." He wanted to ride into the hills, to find her, to tell her that he was still holding the water. just as Coda had asked. But he was afraid. He was a man who had faced cannon fire without flinching. Yet the thought of seeing hatred in Naya's eyes paralyzed him. 3 weeks passed, and the season began to turn. The heat of summer was giving way to the biting winds of autumn. Ethan was in the general store, buying a sack of flour, when a young boy burst through the door, breathless. "Sheriff, Mr. Cole," the boy gasped. "There is a wagon train, settlers. They are stuck in the blind pass. The sandstorm hit them, and there are bandits pinning them down." Ethan dropped the flour. The blind pass was a narrow choke point 10 miles north, treacherous ground, prone to flash floods and shifting sands. "How many?" Ethan asked, already moving toward the door. 5 wagons, women and kids. The bandits are the remnants of Mercer's crew." Ethan did not hesitate. He ran to the livery stable, saddled Buster in record time, and grabbed his Winchester. He was not the sheriff anymore, but he was the only man who could get there in time. He rode hard, pushing Buster to the limit. The wind was picking up, whipping the sand into a blinding beige wall. Visibility dropped to near zero. When he reached the pass, the situation was dire. The wagons were circled in a loose defensive formation, but the bandits were firing from the rocks above, picking them apart. A wagon was already burning. Ethan dismounted and moved through the rocks, flanking the bandits. He fired 2 shots, dropping a man who was aiming at a woman trying to douse the fire. "Get down!" Ethan roared, his voice cutting through the wind. The bandits turned, surprised by the new threat. Ethan levered his rifle, firing with the cold precision of a veteran. But there were too many of them. Bullets chipped the rock around his head, forcing him down. He was pinned, just like that day in the canyon. Then, through the howling wind, a familiar sound echoed, a war cry. From the opposite ridge, figures emerged from the dust like spirits. They were not bandits. They were Red Elk warriors, and leading them was Naya. She rode her paint horse down the steep slope, firing her revolver with one hand and guiding the horse with her knees. She crashed into the flank of the bandit line, scattering them. Ethan broke cover, pushed them back. He and Naya moved toward each other, pinching the bandits between 2 fires. The outlaws, realizing they were fighting a coordinated attack from 2 sides, broke and ran, disappearing into the storm. Ethan lowered his rifle. He stood in the swirling sand, his chest heaving. Naya pulled her horse up 10 feet away. She looked wild, her hair whipping across her face, her eyes fierce. She looked at Ethan. For a long moment, neither spoke. The storm raged around them, but in that small circle of space, it was quiet. "You are far from the mountains," Ethan shouted over the wind. "The storm does not care about borders," Naya shouted back. "And neither do wolves." They turned their attention to the wagons. Together, they worked to secure the settlers. Ethan organized the men to put out the fire. Naya and her warriors helped calm the frightened horses and guided the wagons to a sheltered alcove beneath the cliffs where the wind was less brutal. That night, the storm blew itself out, leaving a clear, cold sky filled with stars. The settlers had set up a camp. They looked at Naya and her warriors with fear at first, but after seeing them share food and water, the fear turned to a cautious curiosity. Ethan sat by a small fire on the perimeter, away from the main camp. He was nursing a cup of coffee, staring into the flames. He heard the soft tread of moccasins. Naya sat down across from him. She did not look at him immediately. She held her hands out to the fire. "You fought well today," Naya said. "You saved my hide again," Ethan replied, a small smile touching his lips. "I am starting to lose count." 3 times, Naya said. "You owe me 3 horses." Ethan chuckled, a rusty sound. "I only have 1, but he is a good one." Silence settled between them again, but it was not the heavy silence of the lake after the battle. It was the companionable silence of 2 soldiers after a fight. "I heard you quit," Naya said, looking at his chest where the badge used to be. "I did not quit," Ethan said. "I just stopped pretending." "The town says you are a hero," Naya said. "They say you cleaned the rot from the valley." I just buried the dead, Ethan said, his voice darkening. I could not save Coda. Naya flinched. She looked down at her hands. No, you could not. I am sorry. Naya, Ethan said, leaning forward. I wake up every night wishing I had been faster, wishing I had seen that soldier sooner. It was not your bullet, Naya said softly. I blamed you. For a long time, I sat on the mountain and hated you because it was easier than hating myself. Yourself. I was the one who believed in peace, Naya said, tears shining in her eyes. I convinced Coda to hold his fire. If we had attacked sooner, maybe he would be alive, or maybe you would all be dead, Ethan said gently. War does not have if-onlys. Naya, it just has what it is. He reached across the fire and took her hand. It was rough, calloused, a warrior's hand, but it trembled in his grip. I was a soldier for 10 years, Ethan said. I rode with generals who burned villages. I saw things that made me want to tear my own eyes out. I carried that guilt like a stone in my gut. I thought I was damned. Naya looked at him, seeing the raw honesty in his face. But then, Ethan continued, I found a lake. And I found a woman who looked at me not as a uniform, but as a man. You woke me up. Naya, you made me remember that I have a soul. Naya squeezed his hand. And you, Ethan Cole, you showed me that a man can throw away his power to save a stranger. That is not the act of an enemy. We are not enemies, Ethan whispered. We are just two people who are tired of fighting alone. Naya moved around the fire. She sat beside him, their shoulders touching. She leaned her head on his shoulder. It was a gesture of profound trust, one that bridged the gap between their cultures and their grief. The lake is quiet now, Ethan said. The railroad is gone. The water is safe. The water is lonely, Naya murmured. It misses the wolf and the horse. Ethan put his arm around her, pulling her close. The warmth of her body against his was the only anchor he needed. Maybe, Ethan said, looking up at the vast, starry sky. It is time for them to go back. They sat there until the fire burned down to embers, finding forgiveness not in grand declarations, but in the simple act of sitting together in the dark, watching for the dawn. They were both scarred, both grieving, but as the first light of morning touched the peaks, they knew they were no longer broken. They were healing. Together. The gavel struck the wooden desk, but this time, the sound was not one of judgment, but of finality. It was 3 months after the rain had washed the blood for the basin of the sacred lake. The location was not a courtroom, but the large oak table in the center of the Redstone Town Hall. Sitting on one side was Arthur Sterling, the new regional director for the Western Iron Line. He was a man of precise manners and nervous hands, sent from Chicago to clean up the catastrophic mess Silas Harlow had left behind. On the other side sat Elder Grey Wolf of the Red Elk tribe, his face a map of deep lines and ancient sorrows. And sitting between them, acting not as a sheriff, but as a bridge, was Ethan Cole. The terms are agreed upon, Ethan said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of the silence in the room. The railway will divert its path 5 miles to the south. Utilizing the lower pass, the company relinquishes all claims to the water rights of the basin known as Cole's Lake. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, adjusting his spectacles. And in return, the tribe agrees to cease all hostilities and allow the survey team safe passage through the southern corridor. The hostilities ended when you stopped burning our homes, Elder Grey Wolf said, his English slow and deliberate. He looked at Ethan. We agree, but not on paper. Paper burns. Paper lies. We agree on the water. Ethan looked at Sterling. It is the way it has to be. Arthur, a handshake, eye to eye. If you break it, no court in the territory will save you. The land itself will reject you. Sterling hesitated, looking at the grim-faced warrior standing behind the elder, and then at Ethan, whose reputation had grown into something of a legend in the last 90 days. Very well, Sterling said. He stood up and extended his hand. Elder Grey Wolf stood. He gripped the white man's hand. not with submission, but with the strength of an equal. There were no flashbulbs, no cheering crowds, just the scratching of a pen on a map to mark the new boundary, and the rustle of buckskin against wool. As the meeting adjourned and the men filed out into the bright autumn sunlight, the mayor of Redstone approached Ethan. He held a small velvet box in his hand. "Ethan," the mayor said, opening the box to reveal a silver star, larger and heavier than the tin one Ethan had thrown away. "The governor has authorized the creation of a U.S. Marshal post for this district. It is yours. The pay is $80 a month. You would have authority over the entire county." Ethan looked at the badge. It shone with the promise of power, of respect, of a restored career. He thought of the years he had spent polishing his old badge, believing it defined who he was. He smiled, a genuine, easy expression that softened the hard angles of his face. "No, thank you, Mayor," Ethan said. "But why?" the mayor stammered. "You are the best lawman we have ever seen." "I am not a lawman anymore," Ethan said, looking toward the distant purple peaks of the mountains. "I am just a man who wants to build a house, and I promised someone I would protect this place, not with a piece of metal, but with my life. That badge belongs to the government. My life belongs to me." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving the mayor standing in the dust, holding a silver star that suddenly looked very small. Ethan chose a spot on the northern rise of the basin, a place where the pine trees met the red rock. It was land that technically sat on the border of his deed and the tribal territory. It was a threshold. For weeks, the sound of a hammer and saw echoed across the water. He worked alone, shirtless under the midday sun, his muscles moving with a rhythm that was meditative. He was building a cabin, sturdy and simple, with a wide porch that looked out over the water. He did not know if she would come. He had not seen Naya since the night of the storm. He knew she needed time to mourn Coda, to reconcile the loss of her brother with the survival of her people. He respected her silence, though it gnawed at him. One afternoon, late in October, the air turned gold with the changing light. The aspens in the high country were flaming yellow, and the wind carried the sharp, clean scent of approaching winter. Ethan was on the roof, nailing the last of the cedar shingles into place. He paused to wipe the sweat from his brow with his forearm. He looked down at the lake. The water was perfectly still, a mirror reflecting the sky and the ridge, and in that reflection, he saw a horse. He froze. He looked up, toward the far bank. Naya Red Elk sat on her paint horse, watching him. She wore a heavy woolen poncho over her buckskins. Her hair had grown out slightly, framing her face in jagged, dark waves. Ethan slowly set his hammer down. He climbed down the ladder, his boots hitting the earth with a thud. He walked toward the water's edge, his heart hammering against his ribs harder than he had ever hammered a nail. Naya nudged her horse forward. The animal splashed gently through the shallows, crossing the narrow inlet to reach the side where the cabin stood. She stopped 10 feet from him. She looked at the cabin, then at him. "The roof looks straight," she said. Her voice was the same husky, low, and capable of stopping his breath. "I used a level," Ethan said, "and a good eye. You built it close to the water," Naya observed. "I wanted to be near the source," Ethan replied. Naya swung her leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground. She walked up to him. Up close, he could see the faint lines of grief that still etched the corners of her eyes. But the darkness that had clouded her gaze after the battle was gone. In its place was a quiet, steady resolve. "I had a dream," Naya said softly. "Coda came to me. He was standing in the water, right here. He was not bleeding. He was laughing. He told me that the water only flows if the path is clear. He told me my path was blocked by a stone I was carrying." "And did you put the stone down?" Ethan asked. "I dropped it at the top of the pass," Naya said. "It was the stone of believing that I had to be alone to be strong." She stepped closer. The space between them, once filled with suspicion and then war, was now filled only with the golden light of the afternoon. "Do you remember the first time we met here?" Naya asked, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. I told you to turn around or bleed. Ethan laughed, a rich, deep sound. I remember. I thought you were going to skin me alive. I considered it, Naya admitted. But then you turned your back. You gave me respect when you could have taken advantage. That was the moment. Ethan. That was when the stone began to crack. Ethan reached out and took her hands. They were warm. I lost my peace that day, Ethan said, looking deep into her eyes. I spent 5 years trying to sleep without nightmares. Then I saw you, and I realized that peace wasn't about silence. It was about finding the one thing worth fighting for. I lost my peace, Naya, but I found you. And now, I do not want the peace back if it means losing you. Naya squeezed his hands. She looked past him at the half-finished cabin, then back at his face. Are you sure, Ethan? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Are you sure you want to tie your life to a woman who does not belong to your world? The town will whisper, my people will watch you with hawk eyes. It will not be an easy road. I am not looking for an easy road, Ethan said. I am looking for the right one. My world is not the town. Naya, my world is wherever you are standing. As long as this water is between us. Naya pulled her hands free, but only to move them. She walked to the edge of the lake. She dipped her left hand into the cold water, then turned and placed her wet palm flat against Ethan's chest, right over his heart. The water soaked through his shirt, cool against his skin. This is the way of my clan, Naya said formally. I pledge to walk beside you. I will share your fire and your fight. I will be the shield at your back. As long as you do not turn your back on this land or my people. Ethan covered her hand with his own, pressing it closer to his heart. I choose you, Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. And I choose this lake. The badge is gone. Naya, the ambition is gone. Everything else can be lost. Everything else can fade. But this choice will not. I am yours. There was no priest to bless them. No choir sang. There was only the wind in the pines and the witness of the red rocks that had stood for 1,000 years. It was a vow made by 2 adults who had seen the worst of the world and decided to build something better from the wreckage. Time in the West flowed like the seasons, harsh, then gentle, then harsh again. But around the cabin by the lake, time seemed to weave a new pattern. A year passed. Then, too, the cabin grew. Ethan added a stable for the horses and a smokehouse. Naya planted a garden of squash and corn using the irrigation methods of her ancestors, while Ethan built fences to keep the deer out, though he often left the gate open because Naya refused to deny the animals food. The scar of the railway faded. The earth reclaimed the torn track bed where the battle had been fought. The grass grew tall and green over the spot where Coda had fallen, nourished by the rain and the memory of a hero. One summer afternoon, the air was filled with the sound of laughter. A group of children from Redstone boys with dusty trousers and girls in calico dresses were running along the shore. Running with them were children from the Red Elk tribe. They were skipping stones across the water, competing to see whose stone could jump the furthest. There was no line in the sand. There was no us and them. There were only children. The heat and the joy of the water. Ethan stood on the porch, leaning against the railing, smoking a pipe. He watched a young boy from a town trip and scrape his knee. A Red Elk girl stopped, helped him up, and brushed the dirt from his leg. Ethan smiled. Down by the trough he had built near the spring, Buster, his old roan gelding, was drinking deeply. Beside him stood Naya's paint horse, and sipping from the overflow, wary but unafraid, was a gray wolf that had come down from the high timber. The animals drank together, heads lowered, sharing the lifeblood of the desert. The painting in the cave had come to life, not through magic, but through the stubborn, enduring power of coexistence. Naya stepped out onto the porch behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her chin on his shoulder. They are loud today, she murmured, watching the children. It is a good noise, Ethan said. Better than gunfire. Much better. She agreed. She turned him around so he was facing her. The sun was setting, casting a warm, amber glow over her face. She looked beautiful not just with the wild beauty of the warrior he had first met, but with the settled, radiant beauty of a woman who was loved. "Ethan," she said, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "Do you remember what you said about losing your peace?" "I remember every word," he said. "Good, because tonight, I want to remind you of something else." She took his hand and led him off the porch, down the steps, toward the water. The children had gone home as the sun dipped low. The lake was empty, vast, and private. "Where are we going?" Ethan asked, though he suspected the answer. Naya stopped at the edge of the water. She began to untie the laces of her tunic. "In this lake," Naya said softly, "you saw me when I was most vulnerable. I was naked, and I was afraid, though I hid it with a knife. You saw me, Ethan. You saw the woman beneath the warrior." She let the tunic fall to the sand. "Tonight," she whispered, stepping close to him, her fingers reaching for the buttons of his shirt. "I want to see you. I want you to drop your armor. No gun, no past, no guilt, just you." Ethan stood still as she undressed him. He felt the cool evening air on his skin, but he felt no cold. He felt only the heat of her gaze. When they were both standing at the water's edge, stripped of everything that the world used to define them, Naya took his hand and pulled him into the lake. The water was cool, silky against their skin. They waded out until they were waist deep, the same depth where they had shared their first kiss, the same depth where they had stood the night of the treaty. Naya wrapped her arms around his neck, the water buoyancy lifting her slightly. Ethan held her, his hands resting on her waist, skin against skin. "Do you see?" Naya whispered, leaning her forehead against his. "The water does not care who we were. It only holds who we are." She kissed him then. It was not a desperate kiss of survival, nor a tentative kiss of new love. It was a kiss of deep, abiding passion, a celebration of the peace they had carved out of the chaos. Ethan laughed a sound of pure, unburdened joy as Naya splashed water over his shoulders. He pulled her closer, and they moved together in the deepening twilight, two souls swimming in the same stream. Finally, truly home. The sun disappeared behind the western peaks, leaving a trail of fire in the sky. Far in the distance, miles to the south, the faint, lonely whistle of a train echoed through the valley. It was a mournful sound, but it was distant. It no longer threatened them. The iron snake had been tamed, forced to bend its path around the will of the water. Ethan and Naya sat on the bank, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars emerge one by one. Naya looked up at the Milky Way, the river of souls in her culture. She thought of Coda. She imagined him somewhere up there, looking down at the lake he had died for. And she knew, with a certainty that settled in her bones, that he was smiling. He had asked them to hold the water, and they were holding it, not with weapons, but with a love that had become the strongest root in the valley. Ethan looked at the woman beside him. He looked at the house they had built. He looked at the water that stretched out black and calm before them. He had spent his life believing that justice was something you enforced, something you wore on your chest. He had been wrong. Justice was not a badge. Justice was the courage to stand in the middle of the road when the world wanted to run you over. Justice was the bravery to love someone the world told you to hate. The West was still wild. There were still storms, and wolves, and men with greed in their hearts. But here, by the Lake of Souls, there was a sanctuary. Ethan Cole kissed the top of Naya's head and pulled the blanket tighter around them. "We held it," he whispered. "We held it," she echoed. And in the silence of the high desert, under the watchful gaze of a million stars, that was enough. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope the journey of Ethan and Naya touched your heart as much as it did mine to write it. It is a reminder that even in the harshest landscapes, love can bloom if we are brave enough to water it. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below and tell me where you are listening from today. Are you in a busy city dreaming of the open range? Or are you somewhere quiet watching the sunset? Let's share our stories. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to my channel. Wild West Tales. Hit that like button to show your support. And if you really want to help this story reach more people, smash that hype button. Your support keeps these campfires burning. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open. Goodbye.